So I know that last week you were watching the Voting Rights Act, like all of us. What does this mean for Democratic strategy? We've seen that Democrats have been fighting some fire with fire in Virginia and California by redoing their redistricting processes temporarily. But let's face it, this is all on war at this point, thanks to the Supreme Court. Do you think that Democrats have it in them to do this kind of hardball redistricting everywhere that they can?
I think they do, and it seems they're already indicating that that's the way that they're leaning. And you saw Hakeem Jeffries last week essentially saying that if Republicans go ahead and start nullifying Democrats' existence across these southern states, Democrats have no other option but to respond in kind. And that could look like zeroing out Republican representation in places like Colorado, in places like California, which could create a 52-0 map. And so I think Republicans are playing with fire right now, and Democrats are going to have to match fire with fire if Republicans head down this path. I mean, what this decision ultimately means is that there will be a severe lack in representation for voters of color, in the long run. In the short run, it may mean 1 to 4 seats potentially heading towards Republicans ahead of the midterms. But Democrats, I think, have no option that if they go with this maximalist route of kind of, eliminating every Democratic seat in the South, I think you're going to have to look at some of these other states matching that fire, and it seems like they have the appetite, and I'm really glad to see it from Democratic leadership, because they have been very reluctant to embrace this fighting fire with fire strategy in places like Virginia. I mean, it was a tough pull to get them over the hump on that, and now that they've done it, I think that they're pretty glad that they did, and so I think it's it's more evidence that this is the kind of strategy that you have to embrace as you're fighting authoritarianism and this attempt to seize power even before votes are cast in a midterm election.
Democrats have been really hesitant to embrace court reforms, like talking about expanding the Supreme Court and trying to perhaps impose term limits and ethics reforms and all of the things that seem rather necessary given just how partisan the Supreme Court is, and a lot of their just absolutely sweeping decisions, from giving Trump immunity back in 2024 to the Voting Rights Act to Dobbs and so on. Do you think that if Democrats are able to achieve a trifecta at some point soon, that we will see the Democrats will embrace court packing and some of these more extreme solutions?
I mean, I don't know that they really have any choice. I mean, we're looking at a situation where, Trump could potentially appoint another Supreme Court justice to replace some of the aging justices, conservative justices already on the court. If God forbid, one of those justices passes before the end of his 4-year term, he might have the option to appoint another one. And so you're looking at a stacked majority in which there could be two liberal members on the court. There is almost no Democratic policy that can sustain that in that environment when anything can get lifted up to the Supreme Court. They can strike things down. They're putting things on they're ruling things down on this shadow docket. Democrats almost have no choice but to look at reforms to the court, and that could be anything from, establishing term limits all the way to expanding the size of the court. There's different ways to do some of those reforms. Some of them require constitutional amendments. Some of them might just require Congress passing laws. But I think they do have to embrace it. I would love to see some of those 2028 candidates really start to talk about the court in their runs for president. And I think, honestly, the appetite, as you've kind of alluded to, has been really grown. And I think one of the things you didn't mention there was like the huge ethical lapses over the last 4 or 5 years. I think during the Biden term, stuff around Justice Clarence Thomas accepting, financial compensation to put his kids through school and certain houses. And I mean, it's just crazy. And some of this stuff fades from the news, and I think voters tend to forget about it. I think it's incumbent on Democrats to keep this, center of the bullseye in election years. And also, I think with these rulings, you have, like the VRA ruling, if mifepristone does get struck down at the Supreme Court, you're going to see another huge conversation about what we can be doing to reform this court. And I think that's only going to be growing the appetite for serious reform among voters as well, because these are extremely unpopular things that they're doing. And like it or not, the court can be an arbiter of the law, but at the end of the day, they also are responsive to public opinion, and they don't like to admit that, but they are. And public opinion has headed in the wrong direction for them for 10 years or more. So they really got to take a look at some of these reforms, and I think it will be interesting to see which Democrats kind of put this out there in front of voters as they head to the in campaign season in 2028.
I've been thinking about this. Speaking of the word reform, the mid-decade redistricting as a sort of shotgun reform, not in a good way, right? It is taking our system and reshaping it into a different system, sort of willy-nilly, without any sort of forethought for future or medium-term stuff. And we've seen people like even Pete Buttigieg now talking about electoral college reform and popular vote. Do you think that this mid-decade sort of craze, both in blue states and red states, will trigger some sort of, fundamental re-examination of our democracy and of how people are represented and how people vote? I mean, this seems like a really big project that we're doing without any forethought. It's like duct tape.
Yeah. No, I mean, I spent a good bit of time working in the 2020 cycle. I was a communications director for Secretary Castro's presidential campaign. And during that cycle, there was this vibrant conversation about democratic reforms that each candidate would endorse and get behind. I think across the board, everybody was pretty universal on, getting rid of the electoral college would be something that they would support. There was all kinds of just like, I don't want to say litmus tests, because they weren't, litmus tests as to whether you'd have the support of voters, but they were, here's where you stand. Here's where the Democrats stand on all these
Sure.
kind of democracy ethical reforms. And we were pretty in line with all of those reforms, but it didn't seem like any one candidate was really kind of leading with their chin to push this out there in front of voters and make the case that this is going to be a top priority for them once they get into office. I think, looking ahead to 2028, I don't know that that's like, I think now it's not theoretical, right? Like we know that these reforms are needed if we're going to come back from the brink of what has essentially been like a game of like chicken with Republicans, especially on gerrymandering and redistricting, but on any number of ethical reforms. I mean, the amount of like support there is for things like banning stock trading by members of Congress and by the president, regulating around this like crypto scams that Trump is running, the ethical considerations of having your son-in-law and your kids running your private business and making deals with countries that you're negotiating trade with. It's just
that's bad, right?
That's bad. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a whole litany of things.
Making sure.
Right. And I, for one, I've put a lot of thought into this. I, for one, am going to be really interested to see which 2028 candidates, similar to the, court reform issue, which 2028 candidates are going to be putting this out there as kind of, putting political stake behind it. Because to me, like, this is the most important thing. And all of those reforms, whether it's on the economy or on abortion or on immigration, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, whatever it is, which policy that you're leading with as a 2028 candidate, almost none of that can be achieved without, going back to the basics and putting some of these guardrails in form to protect democracy from being exploited like the way it has under this administration. So I really want to see a 2028 candidate kind of articulate a vision for America in which we can address all of these things, so we can actually start to address some of the issues that have overwhelmingly bipartisan support and have had for decades and decades, but can't get anything done because of gridlock in Washington, because of ethical things that are kind of pushing people away from making bipartisan deals or whatever it may be. So I think it is going to be a big issue heading into 2028. I'd like to see more candidates talk about it in 2026. But I do think the Democrats are really starting to kind of articulate those messages now.
Yeah, Sawyer, who are some of the candidates who are talking about that right now?
I think, you mentioned Pete. I think Pete's always been great on this. Obviously, he's extremely articulate and has the ability to kind of frame these things better than almost anybody. I think lately seeing, Senator John Ossoff has been really strong on this, kind of talking about it from the corruption angle. That's another key part of this. I think, his ability to connect affordability, which is obviously going to be kind of the main state issue that gets Democrats elected, with corruption and what the Trump administration, what Trump himself has been able to get away with. Kind of being able to marry those 2 points in such an articulate way has been really fascinating to see. I think you're going to see a lot of candidates approach it in different ways. And, obviously no one's throwing their hat in there right now for running for 2028, but you're starting to see them articulate it on their own campaign trails. You're starting to see them put out videos, short form videos on social media about it. I really want to see more of it. But I like what I'm seeing so far from some of these potential 2028 candidates.
Who you got?
Oh, I don't have anybody. I'm way too far. Like they haven't even scratched the surface of what I need before I start considering support. I mean, like we have to demand so much more out of these people heading into 2028. Like this is the most important nominee we could ever possibly pick. And so like my criteria is going to be extremely high, and I don't imagine that I'm going to have any sort of decision on that until, we're a few months out away from primaries, honestly.
Yeah.
We had like over 20 candidates running in the 2020 cycle. Do you think that we'll be looking at that for 2028, that kind of a massive field?
It sure seems like it. I mean, there's a host of governors who are interested in running. There's obviously a bunch of senators who are interested in running. There's even a few members of the House who might throw their hat in. But I also think we have the potential here, in such a strange cycle after a major defeat in 2024, you have a few people in the private sector, in this kind of celeb world, looking at running. I think it's going to be a very interesting cycle. I don't know if it's going to be as many candidates as 2020, but I think it should be it's a similar environment in which Democrats feel like they have a strong opportunity to win. The whole kind of country right now at this point, obviously we're still pretty far away, is really turning against Trump and Republicans. We're looking at a midterm cycle that Democrats could wipe Republicans off the map in a whole bunch of different places. So you have to imagine that there's a bunch of 2028 potential candidates looking at this and saying, if I'm going to run for president, and a lot of these guys obviously do want to run for president, this is probably the cycle to do it. And even if you don't think that you're going to win, running in a field of 25 candidates, if you don't make it all the way to the Iowa caucus, isn't the most embarrassing thing in the world. There's plenty of candidates who didn't make it to the Iowa caucus in 2020 who are still, sitting in the U.S. Senate today. So plenty of options.
I'm curious about, this cycle midterm, November to 28. It does seem like we're headed for a, potential blue wave. I'm knocking on wood, obviously. But once Democrats take the House, let's hope, and there's a fleeting chance that they can do some damage in the Senate as well, they have to actually lead. What are some of the things that they need to do between 26 and 28 to put them in a good position to take the presidency?
Yeah, today marks 6 months from the midterms, which is shocking.
Oh my God.
Like, isn't that insane? Like 6 months from today, the midterms, and it's also 6 months. We're 6 months post the first off-year election. So those elections in Virginia and New Jersey, those were 6 months ago, and in that period of time, Trump has focused on Venezuela. There was the kind of Minnesota, the ICE raid situation, and then Iran. It's like three really kind of like negative, I think, storylines that have really driven Trump's numbers down into the ground. I can't imagine that the next 6 months are going to be kind of this like concerted focus on affordability and the issues that voters care about heading into the midterms. It's going to be a stream of consciousness from Trump, that it's just dominating the news once again. I don't see how they can turn that around. I mean, he's sitting at anywhere between a 32 and 35% approval rating. This weekend, the Washington Post had a poll out, had the highest 62% disapproval, the highest disapproval rating he's ever had in office. He's underwater on the economy and in immigration and inflation and wars, and it's just across the board terrible. Democrats, I think, have an incredible opportunity not just to take the House. I think that they will take the Senate. We have an opportunity to compete in places like Iowa, in places like Texas, in places like North Carolina. I mean, like we really do have a chance to not just like take the House and Senate, but take it by a few seats and really be able to deliver some massive changes. My thing for Democrats is I don't necessarily think that they need a contract with America, but I would love to see Democrats leadership in the House and Senate be able to spell out exactly the things that we're going to be able to achieve with a Democratic majority, even with Trump in the White House. Here are the things that we know that we can lead on accountability measures. That's very important. I think that's what voters want most, is a check on how like the horrible toxic agenda that Trump is putting out on a daily basis. Accountability, for the people who have broken the law too. And then the flip side of that is like, what can we be working with Republicans to pass? What are the things that we actually do have consensus on? We could ban stock trading among members of Congress. We could, put regulations around crypto. We could, scale back the war in Iran and the president's ability to like operationalize troops around the globe at a moment's notice. I mean, like, there's a number of things that I think a Democratic majority can say right now. This is what we're going to achieve. This is what we will work with Republicans. These are the accountability measures that we want to run, and they should spell that out clearly in writing for voters, so that they know what they're voting. Because I think people do have a sense of like, well, is gridlock, is that really what we want? Do we want a party opposite the president in Congress that can get even less done than they are right now? You have to be able to spell out, okay, we can get things done. We can make progress on the issues that you care about. Here are those issues. And by the way, we're going to hold this guy and his administration accountable for breaking the law and everything else.